Greetings, family. I'm going to talk about this book today called The Free Negro in North Carolina from 1790 to 1865. And this is a very good book to read if you want to study the history of black people in North Carolina in particular. The interesting thing about this book is that it goes into the free Negro status, the issues, whether it's immigration, economics, family, and the overall backdrop on how those people had to live given their status. And one thing that I particularly noticed after ascertaining the MO of the European expansion system was that the relationship between the free Negro and the slave was not that different. The one difference between the two, according to this book, was that the free slave could contract and that the Negro slave, or excuse me, the free black was free to contract and that the Negro slave did not have rights to contract because he was in fact bonded and wholly under the ownership of his master. One thing I realized is that the most valuable resource to European Christians during the colonial era were slaves, was human bonded labor. They viewed that and the integrity of that institution as the foundation of their government. Before there was any other rights for any other people to be respected, the property rights of white Englishmen and their slaves were secured through legislation. So why am I saying all of this? When discussing the slave system, the slave society, and trying to ascertain what the free Negro was, is a very ambiguous task because the free Negro was disenfranchised on many levels that other human beings were never subjected to. So why was this possible, especially after 1790, because this is between 1790 and 1865? How was this possible if all men are created equal? And free Negroes who were regarded as free with the right to contract are still being disenfranchised. How is this possible? What you have to understand is that the stripping of being called black in any context, whether free or enslaved, is a form of being a slave. You can be so-called free and still be stripped of your heritage and your culture. And when your heritage and your culture is stripped, all of the rights associated with it are also stripped. So you only inherit blackness as an identity and as a cultural heritage. And blackness was born out of slavery. Whether or not you were freed via meritorious services and a bond being paid by your slave master or former slave master, that didn't make you free. You were still subject to the slave society and the integrity of its institutions. So socially, the free Negro went from an ambiguous, maybe non-existent thing, because it was rarely written about in any way positive, but it became a threat after Nat Turner, after the David Walker's appeal, after all of these riots and rebellions. You begin to see the open hatred and disenfranchisement of the so-called Negro. So much so that the North Carolina Constitution in 1834 was amended to disenfranchise blacks from the right to vote. Whereas previous to that, all freeholders who were landholders, who was in good standing, had a vote. You know, it's very important to realize that the free Negro of before is no different than the free Negro of today. You're still disenfranchised because you're still stripped. You still do not have the heritage and the culture of your ancestors that gives you the right to govern your family, which is the nucleus of government and empires. If you don't have the right to adjudicate affairs and conflicts within your own family as a man, as a Negro, then as a Negro, you are not free. You can't form a nation. Some people say, why do we need to form a nation? We're citizens. Well, for the longest into Dred Scott, we were not citizens. And there was no Supreme Court case that overruled Dred Scott. The 14th Amendment did not overrule Dred Scott. This 1870 Naturalization Act did not overrule Dred Scott. Dred Scott said that blacks were never intended to be citizens. The 1870 Naturalization Act and the 1868 14th Amendment never changed or never intimated a correction claiming that the founding fathers intended blacks to be citizens. So blacks will always be a group of people in America without rights. That must be understood. In the beginning of North Carolina, free blacks migrating into the state was illegal. In the beginning, when slaves were freed, they had to leave North Carolina. Only in certain jurisdictions or certain quote unquote blacks who were shown to be sober, who were shown to be honest, who was shown to be one who was a great person in their community, who was given accolades, because there were some blacks in North Carolina during the colonial era who developed wealth in a way that European white Englishmen viewed as legitimate. And they would be given the accolades because certain places weren't so nice. Certain places were. It all depended on the concentration of blacks in the area. That corresponded with the opinion of white people. More blacks in the area, the opinion of white people becomes more unstable because they believe that more blacks equals more power for blacks. And they don't want power for blacks. They will only big up blacks who live in majority white communities, because then they will be able to feel a sense of safety that they're being cloaked by their majority society. I said a lot, and I'm going to go back into the free Negro in North Carolina, certain North Carolina legislation that affected the free Negro, and why the free Negro is not free. You cannot be denied the right to move freely in and out of the state, the right to possess alcohol, the right to bear firearm. You cannot limit those rights to a people, a race of people who are allegedly free, and then turn around and claim that they're free. And today, all of the denial of civil rights, all of the selective enforcement of law enforcement, putting more blacks into prisons in the situations, even when black people are doing the same crimes as white people, they're getting exaggeratingly more time. They're getting so much more intense punishment, restitution, debt schemes. All of these things are affecting black people because that bonds you, and the form of bondage started from slavery. Anytime a black is bonded to a European institution, it is a vestige of slavery, especially if it is involuntary. And I was wanted to leave y'all brothers with that. Peace.